One man drove a landing craft onto the beaches of Normandy on D-Day under enemy fire with soldiers in the back. Years later, that same man taught a young Jedi how to use the Force. Same person. One of 12 on this list, and what one of them did on the 6th of June 1944 is still discussed by military historians today. Before they were stars, before the premieres and the press photographs and the names above the title, these men were soldiers, sailors, paratroopers, prisoners of war. The British actors of the Golden Age didn't just play wartime heroes on screen. A remarkable number of them had actually been there in uniform, in combat, in prison camps, in the dark, over occupied France. The Second World War touched virtually every corner of British life, and the entertainment industry was no exception. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, do so now, because this is the kind of history that deserves to be told properly, and we've got a great deal more of it to come. 1. Sir Alec Guinness. Let's begin with the man most people today know as Obi-Wan Kenobi. Sir Alec Guinness is, by any measure, one of the most distinguished actors Britain has ever produced. 8 Academy Award nominations over the course of his career. 1 win for The Bridge on the River Kwai in 1957. A knighthood. A body of work that spans everything from Dickens adaptations to David Lean epics to George Lucas science fiction. But in 1941, Alec Guinness was not a film star. He was a young man in his late 20s who had joined the Royal Navy. He was commissioned as an officer and trained to command a landing craft, a flat-bottomed vessel, low in the water, designed with a single operational purpose: to drive directly onto a beach at speed, drop its front ramp, and allow the men inside to run out onto the shore. On the 6th of June, 1944 D-Day, Alec Guinness was commanding one of those landing craft at Normandy. He drove that boat onto the French shore whilst the beach was under fire. He was carrying soldiers, young men heading directly into one of the most ferocious and costly battles of the entire war. His job was to get them there. He did. Guinness rarely made a great deal of it publicly. He was not the sort of man who sought that kind of attention. But the record is clear. The next time you watch him as Obi-Wan Kenobi, that calm, measured, quietly authoritative presence, it is worth knowing that the man behind the performance had, 30 years earlier, driven soldiers onto a beach at Normandy. 2. David Niven. David Niven is perhaps the definitive image of a certain kind of English gentleman, polished, charming, impeccably groomed, with a voice perfectly calibrated for drawing rooms and dinner parties. On screen, he projected effortless ease. Off-screen, his wartime record is considerably more serious than that image suggests. Niven had trained at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, the most prestigious military institution in Britain, the school that has produced British Army officers for centuries. He understood the military from the inside, not merely as an actor playing at it. When the war began, Niven walked away from a flourishing Hollywood career without hesitation. He returned to Britain and re-enlisted. He rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, a senior rank, well above what most servicemen achieved, and he did not serve in a conventional capacity. Niven was attached to a secret reconnaissance unit. The specific work of such units was intelligence gathering, moving ahead of the main forces, observing enemy positions, assessing terrain, and reporting back so that commanders had accurate information before committing troops. It was dangerous, specialized work, and it required a particular kind of composure under pressure. He arrived in France in the days immediately following D-Day, when the fighting remained extremely intense and the outcome was far from settled. He subsequently served through the Northwest Europe campaign. One more detail worth noting: David Niven was one of very few serving officers who was permitted to make films during the war under official sanction for the purpose of maintaining morale on the home front. He appeared in The Way Ahead in 1944, a film made in active wartime. Even that was, in its own way, a form of service. He rarely spoke about the war in later years. Not out of false modesty, simply because he considered it a private matter. 3. Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, had a voice of quite extraordinary depth and resonance, and spent much of his career playing figures of menace and authority, most notably Count Dracula in the Hammer horror films, a role he performed no fewer than 9 times between 1958 and 1973. He was also, during the Second World War, a man with a rather unusual set of professional activities. Lee served initially in the Royal Air Force. He trained as a pilot but was grounded due to a problem with his optic nerves and subsequently transferred. He then worked within the Intelligence Corps, a branch concerned not with direct combat but with gathering, analyzing, and acting upon information about enemy forces and intentions. The precise nature of his wartime work was classified for many decades. Lee was involved in operations connected to the broader D-Day campaign, among other matters, but the details were not something he discussed openly. When he did touch on it in interviews, and he did so rarely, he was careful. He once remarked, when pressed on what he had witnessed during the war, that some things are better left unsaid. From a man who had spent his entire career saying dramatic things in very dramatic ways, that particular silence carries considerable weight. 4. Richard Todd. Richard Todd's wartime story is, without question, the most historically specific and verifiable on this list, and arguably one of the most remarkable personal accounts to emerge from D-Day itself. By the 1950s, Todd was one of the biggest names in British cinema. He had been nominated for the Academy Award for Best Actor in 1949 for The Hasty Heart, and throughout the following decade he was in constant demand for leading roles. He appeared in The Dam Busters, Rob Roy, and numerous other productions, frequently playing military men and wartime heroes. What his audiences may not have known is that he had not merely studied those roles, he had lived something comparable to them. Richard Todd held the rank of lieutenant in the 7th Parachute Battalion, 6th Airborne Division. He was a paratrooper. In the early hours of the 6th of June 1944, before the beach landings at Normandy had even commenced, before dawn had broken over the Normandy coast, Todd and his battalion jumped from their aircraft into the darkness over occupied France. The 6th Airborne Division's mission was to secure the left flank of the Allied invasion. They needed to capture the vital crossings at the Caen Canal and the River Orne, destroy German gun emplacements that could have devastated the beach landings, and hold their positions until the main forces arrived from the sea. Without their success that night, the losses on the beaches could have been catastrophic. The paratroopers went in first, in the dark, behind enemy lines, with no immediate reinforcement available. Todd survived. He fought through D-Day and the subsequent Normandy campaign. Here is the detail that has fascinated historians ever since. In 1962, Richard Todd was cast in the film The Longest Day, a large-scale reconstruction of the D-Day landings. He was given the role of Major John Howard, who had commanded the assault on Pegasus Bridge, the operation that Todd himself, as a young lieutenant, had witnessed and participated in on that same night in 1944. Richard Todd appeared in a film about D-Day, playing a character who was present at an operation Richard Todd himself had taken part in 18 years earlier as a soldier. That is not something a scriptwriter could plausibly invent. We're precisely halfway through, and the accounts only become more remarkable. Subscribe now if you haven't, and do stay with us, because what's coming next moves from the battlefield to the prison camp and involves a plan that was almost too brazen to work. 5. Peter Butterworth. Peter Butterworth is warmly remembered as one of the comic pillars of the Carry On films. He appeared in 16 of them between 1965 and 1979, a record that speaks to how central he was to that particular corner of British comedy. His wartime experience is something rather different in character. Butterworth served as a lieutenant in the Fleet Air Arm, the Royal Navy's aviation branch, responsible for operating aircraft at sea and in support of naval operations. He was shot down during the war, captured, and held as a prisoner of war. What he did inside that camp is the part of the story worth dwelling upon. Butterworth attempted to escape on multiple occasions. In one of the more audacious attempts, he and a group of fellow prisoners devised a plan that required considerable coordination and nerve. A theatrical performance was to be staged for the German guards, a show, with prisoners performing for their captors. While the guards were watching the entertainment, other prisoners out of sight. were engaged in tunneling out beneath the camp. Peter Butterworth was one of the performers in that distraction. He stood on an improvised stage in a prisoner of war camp and performed knowing that the success of the escape and potentially the lives of those tunneling beneath him depended on keeping the guards engaged and unsuspicious. There is an additional detail to this account that has passed into legend. It is reported that the German guards, watching Butterworth perform, found his acting so unconvincing that they became suspicious of him, specifically feeling that no one could be that bad unless they were up to something. Whether or not that particular anecdote is entirely precise in its details, the underlying account is documented. The escape attempt happened. Butterworth was part of it. After the war, he became one of Britain's most beloved comic performers. It is perhaps not surprising that a man who had performed under that particular kind of pressure found the demands of film comedy rather more manageable. 6. Donald Sinden. Donald Sinden had one of the longest and most varied careers in British entertainment, from films in the 1950s through to decades on the stage at the Royal Shakespeare Company, with a voice so distinctive it was frequently used as a benchmark for rich, resonant British diction. During the war, Sinden served in the Royal Navy's Air Branch, in a role focused on coastal defense and the logistics and administration of naval operations, the planning and coordination of ship movements, personnel, and supply. It is the kind of work that receives rather less dramatic attention than a parachute jump or a commando raid, but it was indispensable. The Normandy landings on the 6th of June 1944 required the movement of over 156,000 Allied troops across the English Channel in a single day. They were supported by approximately 5,000 ships and landing craft of various types, and nearly 11,000 aircraft sorties were flown in support of the operation. Every soldier, every weapon, every vehicle, every bag of supplies required planning, scheduling, and coordination. None of it happened by accident. Donald Sinden was part of the administrative and logistical structure that made operations of that scale possible. He was later appointed a CB for his contributions to British theatre, but his service to the country began considerably earlier than his first curtain call. 7. Harry H. Corbett. Harry H. Corbett, the HH, was deliberate to distinguish himself from Harry Corbett. The puppeteer is best remembered in Britain for playing Harold Steptoe in Steptoe and Son, the BBC sitcom that ran from 1962 to 1974 and is rightly regarded as one of the finest pieces of writing in British television history. Corbett served in the Royal Marines. The Royal Marines are a specialized amphibious force infantry soldiers trained specifically for operations that involve moving from sea to land under hostile conditions. They are, by design and training, the kind of force you send first when you are attacking from the water. Corbett served in both the European and Pacific theaters, two entirely separate conflicts, fought under entirely different conditions, on opposite sides of the world. He was a very young man when he did so. He did not in later life make a great deal of it publicly. He returned from the war and got on with building a career. The man who made British audiences laugh every week for 12 years, with his portrayal of the long-suffering Harold Steptoe, had once waded ashore under fire on the other side of the world. 8. Kenneth Connor, Charles Hawtrey, A.N.D. Clive Dunn. 3 more names, all connected to the comedic tradition of British entertainment, all with wartime records that bear examination. Kenneth Connor, a gifted comic actor with exceptional timing and a carry-on veteran whose screen presence was quite distinct from many of his co-stars, served in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps. The RAOC's function was supply, weapons, ammunition, equipment. They were the organization responsible for ensuring that frontline troops had something to fight with. Supply chain failures in military history have ended campaigns. The RAOC made certain that did not happen on the British side. Charles Hawtrey is perhaps the most immediately recognizable face from the Carry On series, a slight, bespectacled man with a distinctively high-pitched voice and a screen persona of cheerful, blissful unawareness. During the war, Hawtrey served with ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association. ENSA deployed performers, actors, comedians, musicians, variety artists to entertain serving troops across every theater of the war. It was not combat. Nobody pretended otherwise. But the maintenance of troop morale was considered sufficiently important that it was organized, funded, and run as a formal military support operation. The men and women who performed for ENSA went to dangerous places and performed in difficult conditions. Hawtrey was one of them. Clive Dunn is the most celebrated name from Dad's army. His portrayal of the ancient, bumbling, but oddly dignified Corporal Jones became one of the defining comic creations of British television. Dunn had been a soldier. He was captured early in the war and spent years as a prisoner of war in German captivity. He knew what it was to be imprisoned by an enemy during wartime, and he spent the following decades playing comic soldiers on a television program that asked its audience to laugh affectionately at the Home Guard. Whatever he brought to that role came from somewhere real. 9. Percy Herbert. Percy Herbert may not be immediately familiar to younger audiences, but to anyone with a serious interest in British cinema of the 1950s and 1960s, his face is unmistakable, a character actor of considerable capability, always reliable, always specific. He appeared in The Bridge on the River Kwai, directed by David Lean, released in 1957. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It tells the story of British prisoners of war held in a Japanese camp in Burma, forced to construct a railway bridge under brutal conditions. Percy Herbert played a soldier in that film. He had been a prisoner of war in a Japanese camp during the actual conflict. The distance between what he was asked to perform and what he had personally experienced was not great. He was not merely an actor embodying a character's suffering, he was a man who had lived something adjacent to it, who knew what captivity under those conditions meant, who carried that knowledge into every scene he appeared in. There is no technique for acquiring that kind of authority. It either exists or it doesn't. 10. Leo McKern. Leo McKern was Australian by birth, born in Sydney in 1920, and is best known internationally for his portrayal of Horace Rumpole in Rumpole of the Bailey, the IT legal drama that ran from 1978 to 1992. Rumpole, irascible, eloquent, addicted to claret and quotations, eternally in conflict with she who must be obeyed, became one of the most beloved characters in British television history, and McKern's performance is inseparable from the role. During the Second World War, McKern served in the Australian Army. Australia's contribution to the Allied war effort is frequently underappreciated in British and American accounts of the conflict. Australian forces fought across North Africa, in the Pacific, in the campaigns in Italy, and in the liberation of Northwest Europe. The Commonwealth nations Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa, India contributed enormously to the Allied effort in manpower, material, and sacrifice. McKern served, survived, moved to Britain after the war, and built one of the most respected acting careers in the country. His wartime service connects him to the global dimension of the conflict, a reminder that the war was not merely a British or American story, but a world story, fought across multiple continents by men from dozens of nations. 12 men. 12 records. Landing craft on the beaches of Normandy. Secret reconnaissance operations behind enemy lines. Intelligence work classified for decades. A paratrooper who jumped into France before dawn on the 6th of June 1944, and then played himself or someone who was standing next to him in a film 18 years later. A prisoner of war who performed on an improvised stage to distract the guards whilst his fellow prisoners tunneled beneath them. Marines in the Pacific, Supply Corps, logistics, entertainers sent to the front lines, former POWs playing comedy soldiers on television. The British entertainment industry of the post-war decades was populated by men who had lived through the defining event of the 20th century. When they played soldiers, they frequently knew what soldiers looked like, because they had been them. When they played prisoners, some had been prisoners. When they projected authority or composure or stoicism, that quality had not been acquired in a drama school. it had been acquired somewhere considerably less comfortable. David Niven returned to Hollywood after the war and said almost nothing about what he had done. Christopher Lee spent decades hinting, without quite saying. Richard Todd turned up on the set of The Longest Day and played a version of events he had personally witnessed. Percy Herbert walked onto the set of The Bridge on the River Kwai carrying knowledge that no amount of preparation could have given anyone else. These are not the stories that made headlines at the time. These are the stories underneath the stories, the histories that existed before the fame, before the cameras, before any of it. If this is the kind of history you are here for, subscribe to the channel. Share this with someone who loves this period, someone who watches the old films without knowing quite how much history is standing in front of the camera. Leave a comment below with the name that surprised you most. We will be back with more.